let's talk about the moon. Here it is over here. Let me bring it over here in front of you. So what we're looking at here is the far side of the moon. This is always the far side. The moon is tightly locked to the Earth. So when you're on the ground looking up, you're always looking at the near side with all the dark splotchy areas on the moon. So let me turn it around here and back it up a bit. Alright, so you see all the dark splotchy areas. These are known as the lunar maria. Each one is called a mare, or sea in Latin. And they're called seas because long ago astronomers thought they were actually bodies of some kind of liquid. But in fact, they're these large, low-lying areas that are the result of early volcanism. And they tend to appear much darker than the rest of the moon because they're iron-rich basaltic material. And basalts tend to be dark and gray. And so all of these dark splotchy areas are named seas, except for this one over here, the big one on the left. This is named as an ocean, Oceanus Procellarum, Ocean of Storms. It's a very pretty name. Now there are other smaller basaltic plains named as bays and lakes and so on. Now the moon is a bit more interesting than what it's made of because it's the only place other than Earth that humans have been to. The space race between USA and the Soviet Union is a fascinating part of human history if you look at all the activity that went on starting in the late 1950s. I only have time to touch upon a small part of this activity here, and I'll show you where some of the major milestones took place. The Soviet Union Space Agency had a program called Luna. So they would just send out mission after mission, all under this Luna program. By contrast, the American Space Agency, NASA, employed several different programs, all with their own objectives, such as Ranger, Surveyor, Lunar Orbiter, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. In 1959, Luna 2, right here, impacted right here on the surface. And by impact I mean it was a hard landing. And that became the first human spacecraft to reach the surface. Later that year, Luna 3 didn't land, but it got the first images from the far side of the moon. And that was quite something, to realize that the other side of the moon that we had never seen before at that point was all of this heavily cratered highlands with just a couple of those little dark sea areas, totally different than what we normally see. 5 years later, in 1964, NASA sent over Ranger 7, which impacted right here. And that became the first American spacecraft to reach the surface. In 1966, a bunch of milestones happened in rapid succession that highlight just how close this race was. The Soviet Luna 9 became the first ever human spacecraft to successfully soft land on the moon. That was right here, on the edge of the ocean. So it soft landed without breaking apart, and it sent back awesome stereo 3D circular panoramas of the surface, which is amazing for the time. Later that year, Surveyor 1 became the first American spacecraft to soft land on the surface. Also later that year, the Soviet Union's Luna 10 became the first spacecraft to successfully orbit. And guess what? It's still there today, in orbit. Luna 10 is the craft that discovered that there are these uneven concentrations of mass under the surface, informally known as mascons, and it's important to know about these because their gravity affects the trajectory of lunar missions of anything flying closely over the surface. So later that year, what do you think Americans managed to pull off? You guessed it, Lunar Orbiter 1 became the first American craft to successfully orbit, again right after the Soviets. In 1968, NASA's Apollo program was heating up. This is the program that would use everything they had learned up to that point to send humans to the moon. Apollo 8 was the first crewed mission with actual people on it, and that managed to do 10 orbits around the moon before returning home to Earth. What an amazing ride that must have been. And if we're lucky, we'll start seeing that sort of trip happen again in the near future. In the following year, we have the famous Apollo 11 mission. Way over here at the bottom of the Sea of Tranquility. This is where the first humans were able to land and set foot on the moon. The astronauts on the ground there nicknamed the landing site Tranquility Base, named after the sea that they landed in. And that was the first time Americans managed to achieve a significant lunar exploration milestone before the Russians did. A year later, the Soviet Luna 17 landed right up here in the Sea of Rains, right here. And that became the first mission to deliver a rover to the surface of another solar system body. And that rover's name was Lunokhod 1, which was an 8-wheeled rover whose name meant Moonwalker. And it ended up roving around for nearly a year after landing. After that, Apollo 15 landed next to Mons Hadley and delivered its own rover, which was really the lunar buggy that astronauts could drive around for miles and miles around the surface. That Soviet rover was remote controlled, of course. In 1972, the final Apollo mission landed right over here, Apollo 17, in the Taurus-Littrow Valley. And that was the last time humans set foot on the moon, at least for now. And then the final Luna mission, Luna 24, touched down right here, and it was a sample return, so it brought back a little bit of lunar regolith, or soil, back to the Earth. So that was 1976. It was quite a dry spell after that, in terms of craft actually reaching the surface with some sort of soft landing, or any kind of landing. And it wasn't until 30 years later, in 2006, that somebody sent a craft to the surface called SMART 1. And who sent it? ESA, the European Space Agency. And that was the first time somebody other than the USA or Soviet Union did something with the lunar surface. Not long after that, in 2008, somebody else sent a craft to the lunar surface called the Moon Impact Probe. And who sent that? The Indian Space Program, ISRO. This probe smashed into a crater at the south pole of the moon called Shackleton Crater, and that is where it discovered water on the moon. In 2013, China's space agency sent and landed Chang'e 3 right up here, returning beautiful high-definition photos of the surface. And the lander served as the first telescope on the moon, as well as putting a rover on the surface named Yutu. At the beginning of 2019, Chang'e 4 pulled off the first soft landing on the far side of the moon, complete with another rover, another space telescope, shielded from the bright Earthshine. So several other space programs are sending rovers to the moon in the very near future, so definitely watch that space. Humanity's expeditions into space are certainly maturing bit by bit, and this is aided by intense computerization and a growing impatience to get back out there. And I don't know about you, but I love the fact that there are now multiple capable space programs around the globe that are doing their work for the sake of exploration and science, without being so focused on winning a race. So let's look forward to a lot of exciting developments on the moon soon. Alright, let's wrap it up here. One more stop here at the Earth and the Moon, and then we take off for Mercury.